Traditional Logic 1. Introduction. What is logic? Introduction. The best way to answer the question, what is logic, is with a definition. But that is easier said than done. Throughout history, many people have thought and written about the subject of logic, and many people have offered definitions. Some of them are useful, and some are not. Josiah Royce, an American philosopher, defined logic as a science of order. But this definition is so general that it really could include things outside of logic, and so it really doesn't tell us much. Other definitions are a little too simple. The writer Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "Logic is logic. That's all I say." That obviously won't help us. The writers of a book on fallacies, we'll explain what those are later, define logic as the defense against trickery. That's one thing logic is, but certainly not all. Much better is a definition given by Raymond McCall. Logic in general is a science of right thinking. Jacques Maritain, a very famous philosopher, had a similar definition. Logic, he said, is the art which enables us to proceed with order, ease, and correctness in the act of reason itself. Irving Copey, who wrote a book on logic still used in many colleges, gets even a little more specific. The distinction between correct and incorrect reasoning is a central problem with which logic deals. As you proceed in this book, you will see that this is so. The history of logic. The 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant called Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, the father of logic. If we are thinking only of traditional or formal logic, which is the only kind of logic we study in this book, this is true. In fact, formal logic has changed hardly at all since the time of Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BC. Shortly after the time of Aristotle, another Greek philosopher laid the groundwork for modern symbolic logic. His name was Chrysippus, 279 to 206 BC. During the Middle Ages, the kind of logic developed by Chrysippus did not receive much attention. But in the 17th and early 18th centuries, philosophers began to take another look at the logical system of Chrysippus. One of the first and most famous of these is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1781 to 1848. Since then, many advances have been made in symbolic logic. In addition, another form of logical thought called induction has become a part of the subject that we know as logic. John Stuart Mill, who lived in the 19th century, pioneered the theories about induction and what we study today. At the end of the 19th century and into our own, other logical methods have been developed, many of which have as much, if not more, to do with mathematics than with philosophy. Gottlob Frege, 1848 to 1925, Alfred North Whitehead, 1861 to 1947, and Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, are names associated with the more modern kinds of mathematical logic. For our purposes, we will stick to the formal logic of Aristotle, which is just as useful today as it was when it was set forth over 2,300 years ago. The two main branches of logic. There are two main branches of logic. One is called formal, or minor, logic, the other material, or major logic. The two branches are quite distinct and deal with different problems. Material logic is concerned with the content of argumentation. It deals with the truth of the terms and the propositions in an argument. Formal logic is interested in the form or structure of reasoning. The truth of an argument is of only secondary consideration in this branch of logic. Formal logic is concerned with the method of deriving one truth from another. The distinction between these two branches of logic was nicely described by G.K. Chesterton. Logic and truth have very little to do with each other. Logic is concerned merely with the fidelity and accuracy with which a certain process is performed. A process which can be performed with any materials, with any assumption. You can be as logical about griffins and basilisks as about sheep and pigs. Logic, then, is not necessarily an instrument for finding out truth, On the contrary, truth is a necessary instrument for using logic. For using it, that is, for the discovery of further truth. Briefly, you can only find truth with logic if you have already found truth without it. This last remark of Chesterton's is important. It is not the purpose of formal logic to discover truth. That is the business of everyday observation, and, in certain more formal circumstances, empirical science. Logic serves only to lead us from one truth to another. That is why, for example, you should not call a statement of fact logical or illogical, although this is commonly done in everyday argument. You should instead call it true or false. Likewise, you should not call an argument which contains several statements of fact true or false. You should only call it valid or invalid. Validity is a term we use when we mean to say that an argument is logical. The term soundness, however, can be applied to an argument to say something about both its truth and its validity. Truth, validity, and soundness. Truth means a correspondence of a statement to reality. An argument is valid when its conclusion follows logically from its premises. The term soundness is used to indicate that all the premises in an argument are true and that the argument is valid. An argument can contain true premises and still be invalid. Likewise, it can be perfectly valid, or logical if you prefer, and contain false premises. But if an argument is sound, its premises must be true and it must be valid. If this sounds confusing, don't worry. These concepts will become clearer as we progress through the material in this book. The components of an argument. An argument contains several components. In order to illustrate what these components are and how they work in the reasoning process, let us begin with a simple argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The first two statements are premises, and the last is a conclusion. All arguments must have at least two premises and one conclusion. On the face of it, this argument contains a number of words making up three statements which fit together into what looks and sounds like an argument. But there is more here than meets the eye. In formal logic, we recognize three kinds of logical processes. We recognize that each of these originates in a mental act, but that each also manifests itself as and is known to us in the form of a verbal expression. Term. The mental act involved in the first of these three logical processes is called simple apprehension. We call the verbal expression of simple apprehension the term. A simple apprehension occurs when we first form in our mind a concept of something. When we put this concept into words, we have put this simple apprehension in the form of a term. At the point of simple apprehension, we do not affirm or deny anything about it. We just possess or grasp it. If in your mind, for example, you think of this book, the one you're reading right now, you are performing this first logical process. You are having a simple apprehension. And if you speak or write anything about it, you will have to use a term, the term book. In the argument above, the one about Socrates, there are three terms representing three simple apprehensions. The first is men, the second is Socrates, and the third is mortal. Each of these represents in our mind a concept that we have transformed into a word. The concept we call the simple apprehension, and the word we call term. Mental act, simple apprehension. Verbal expression, term. Proposition. The mental act involved in the second of these three logical processes is called judgment. The verbal expression of a judgment is called a proposition. We perform a judgment any time we think in our mind that something is something else, which we call affirmation, and also when we think that something is not something else, which we call denial. To judge is to affirm or deny. If you think that this book is boring, then you're performing a judgment. If you verbally express this judgment, you will have to do it in the form of a proposition. The proposition, this book is boring. The judgment is a mental act you have when you think that this book is boring, and the proposition is a statement you make to express that thought. In the argument above, there are 3 propositions expressed. The first is, all men are mortal. The second is, Socrates is a man. And the third is, Socrates is mortal. Each one of these represents in our mind a thought that something is something else, that all men are mortal, that Socrates is a man, and that Socrates is mortal. We should point out that some people use the word statement instead of proposition. They mean the same thing, but to be consistent, we will use the word proposition. Mental act, judgment. Verbal expression, proposition. Syllogism. The mental act involved in the third of these 3 logical processes is called deductive inference. We call the verbal expression of deductive inference the syllogism. A deductive inference occurs when we make the logical connections in our mind between the terms in the argument in a way that shows us that the conclusion either follows or does not follow from the premises. When we verbally express this in an argument, we have put this deductive inference in the form of a syllogism. It is at this point that we are said to make progress in knowledge. It is through the process of deductive inference as expressed in a syllogism that we can say, as we explained above, that we have gone from one truth or set of truths to another truth. Let's say the reason you think this book is boring is because you think all books are boring. If this were true, you would be performing a deductive inference. You would be thinking to yourself, all books are boring, and this is a book. Therefore, this book is boring. And if you verbally express this deductive inference, you would do it in the form of a syllogism. The judgment expressed by all books are boring and this is a book are different than the judgment, this book is boring. Through deductive inference, however, you can go from these first 2 to the last one. In this way, you have gone from one set of truths to another truth, if indeed they are true, which hopefully they are not. We would say that the argument above, the one about Socrates, in its entirety is a syllogism. It expresses a deductive inference that logically connects certain simple apprehensions that are parts of 3 judgments. And this process has been expressed in the form of a syllogism. Mental act, deductive inference. Verbal expression, syllogism. If we now put this all together, keeping our distinction between mental acts and verbal expressions, it would look like this. Mental act, simple apprehension. Verbal expression, term. Mental act, judgment. Verbal expression, proposition. Mental act, deductive inference. Verbal expression, syllogism. In order to give ourselves a mental picture of these 3 logical processes, let us think of a man walking. In order to get from, say, one room to another, he has to pick up his foot and take several steps in order to get to the room that is his destination. The initial act, picking up his foot, is like the initial logical act of simple apprehension. Taking a full step is like making a judgment. And stringing all the steps together into one movement is like deductive inference. We move from one place to another. Summary. We started out by defining logic as the science of right thinking. We said there are 2 main branches of logic. One is called formal or minor logic, the other material or major logic. Material logic is concerned with the content of argumentation. Formal logic is interested in the form or structure of reasoning. We define truth as correspondence with reality. We said an argument is valid when its conclusion follows logically from its premises. And we say that soundness indicates that all the premises in an argument are true and that the argument is valid. We said also that all arguments must contain 2 premises and a conclusion. And we said finally that there are 3 mental acts that make up the logical process: simple apprehension, judgment, and deductive inference. These 3 mental acts correspond to 3 verbal expressions: term, proposition, and syllogism.